The Wedding of Zein by Tayyib Saleh. The Wedding of Zayn. Arus Zayn. Have you heard the news? Zayn is getting married, said Halima, the seller of milk, to Amna, who had as usual called before sunrise, as she measured her out a piastre's worth. The jug all but fell from Amna's hands, and Halima, profiting by her preoccupation, gave her short measure. At noon, the courtyard of the intermediate school was quiet and deserted, the students having gone to their classes. From afar there appeared a young boy hurrying along breathlessly, the end of his outer garment tucked under his arm, till he came to a stop in front of the door of the second year, the headmaster's form. "You ass of a boy! What's made you so late?" A look of cunning flashed momentarily in Turayf's eyes. "Sir, have you heard the news?" "News about what, you animal of a boy?" The headmaster's anger, however, did not shake the boy's composure. Checking his laughter, he said, "They're marrying off Zayn the day after tomorrow." The headmaster's lower jaw dropped in astonishment, and Turayf escaped punishment. And in the market, Abdul Samad advanced towards Sheikh Ali's shop, his face flushed, leaving it in no doubt that he was in an angry frame of mind. There was a debt owing to him from Sheikh Ali, the tobacco dealer, which the latter had put off paying off for a whole month. He was determined to have it settled that very day by hook or by crook. "Ali, do you really think you'll do me out of my money, or what is it you've got in mind?" "Hajj Abdul Samad, just put your trust in God and sit down and have a cup of coffee with us." "To hell with your coffee. Get up and open this safe of yours and give me my money. If you're determined not to pay, just say so." Sheikh Ali spat the quid of tobacco from his mouth. "Come along and sit down and I'll tell you a bit of news." "I've got no time, neither for you nor for your bit of news. I know well enough that you're trying to fool me and talk me out of my money." "I swear your money's here safe and sound. Come along and sit down, and I'll tell you the story of Zayn's marriage." "Whose marriage did you say?" "Zayn's marriage." Abdul Samad seated himself and, placing both hands on top of his head, remained silent for a while. Sheikh Ali regarded him, elated at the effect he had produced. Eventually Abdul Samad found his tongue. "Ah, there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the Prophet of God." "By the Prophet himself, Sheikh Ali, what sort of story's that?" Abdul Samad did not settle his debt that day. By midday, everyone's tongue was wagging with the news. Zayn himself was at the well in the center of the village, filling the women's pitchers for them and indulging in his usual antics. The children gathered round him and began chanting, "Zayn's getting married, Zayn's getting married," while he hurled stones at them, tugged at a girl's dress, prodded a woman in her middle, or pinched another's thigh. Children laughed, the women shrieked and laughed, and above all, this laughter could be heard, the laugh that had become part of the village ever since Zayn was born. At first, as is well known, children meet life with screams. With Zayn, however, it is recounted, and the authorities for this are his mother and the women who attended his birth, that no sooner did he come into this world than he burst out laughing, and so it was throughout his life. He had grown up with only 2 teeth in his mouth, one in his upper jaw and one in the lower. His mother, though, says that his mouth was once filled with pearly white teeth, but that when he was 6, she took him one day to visit some relatives of hers. At sunset, passing by a deserted ruin rumored to be haunted, Zayn had suddenly become nailed to the ground and had begun shivering as with a fever. Then he let out a scream. After that, He took to his bed for several days, and on recovering from his illness, it was found that all his teeth had fallen out, except for one in his upper jaw and one in the lower. Zayn had an elongated face with prominent bones to his cheeks, his jaw, and under the eyes. His forehead was rounded and jutted out. His eyes were small and permanently bloodshot, their sockets deeply set in his face like two caverns. His face was completely hairless, with neither eyebrows nor eyelashes, and on attaining manhood no hair had sprouted on his chin or upper lip. This face of his was supported by a long neck. Among the nicknames given to Zayn by the children was the giraffe, which stood on two powerful shoulders that straddled the rest of the body, forming a triangle. The two long arms were like those of a monkey, the hands coarse with extended fingers ending in long, sharp nails. Zayn never paired them. His chest was concave, his back slightly hunched, while his legs were long and spindly like those of a crane. His feet were splayed and bore the traces of ancient scars. Zayn disliked wearing shoes, and he remembered the story behind each one of them. For example, the story of a long scar on his right foot extending from the back of the ankle to the opening between the first and second toes. Zayn recounted as follows: "Now, this scar, man, has a story to it." And Mahjub would egg him on with the words, "And what story would this be, you good for nothing? Did you go off to steal and they give you a hiding with a thorn tree branch?" This would have a splendid effect on Zayn, who would fall over backwards, legs raised high in the air and hands beating the ground, while continuing to give vent to that strange and singular laughter that resembled a donkey's braying. Unaffected by him, everyone else would burst out into loud, reverberating guffaws. Collecting himself, Zayn would wipe the tears away with his scuff and say, Yeah, so I did go off to steal." Mahjub would again egg him on. "And what did you go off to steal, you scoundrel? Perhaps you said to yourself you'd look around for something to eat." And Zayn, wiping his hands across his face, would once again break into laughter, and those present would presume that he had come by that particular scar entering some house to steal food, for he was well known for his insatiable greed. At wedding feasts, when the trays of food were brought in and the people formed themselves into circles around them, each group tried to avoid having Zayn sitting with him, as he would dispose of everything in the dish in a flash, leaving nothing for anyone else. "Do you remember what you did at Saeed's wedding?" Abdul Hafiz said to him. "Certainly I do," Zayn answered with a guffaw. "By God, I would have eaten up the whole right down to the last bit of Ismail's son. God damn him, hadn't caught me." Zayn had been entrusted with transporting the food at Saeed's wedding and had walked back and forth between the diwan, where the men were congregated, and the kitchen at the back of the house, where the women were doing the cooking. On the way from the kitchen to the diwan, Zayn dawdled along, eating choicest bits from the dish he was carrying, so that on arrival it was all but empty. He did this three times before Ahmed Ismail noticed what was happening and followed him. Halfway to the diwan, Zayn stopped and lifted the lid off a dish filled with fried chicken. No sooner had he taken hold of a chicken and brought it to his mouth than Ahmed Ismail pounced upon him and gave him a sound beating. "Come along," Mahjub again asked him. "Why don't you tell us what you went off to steal, you rogue?" When Zayn noticed that the people around him were all agog to hear, he sat up straight, placed his arms between his knees, and said, "Last summer, at the time of the harvesting of the millet, I was kept late at the water wheel. The moon was a twinkle as I tossed my shawl across my shoulder and came up homewards. I tell you, when I reached the patch of sand by the edge of the village, I heard the sounds of joyful ululation." Yes, that's quite right, Mahjub interrupted him. That was Bakri's wedding. Zayn continued, and so I told myself I'd go along and see what it was all about. Now it seems that the Talha people were having a wedding, and when I got there, I found that things had really hotted up, a proper hula balu with drums and ululations. The first thing I did was to go off and look to see if I could find something to eat. The gathering burst into laughter, for it was what they had expected. The women in the kitchen gave me some bits of meat to eat and something bitter to drink. That must have been arak, you good for nothing, said Mahjub. No, it wasn't arak, said Zayn. Do you think I don't know what arak is? I'm telling you, man, this thing I drank really flew to my head. Afterwards, I slipped out of the kitchen and went into a room where I found a group of women and the smell of perfumes and scented ointments. May I divorce if the very smell didn't intoxicate me. Abdul Hafiz laughed. And where is the woman you'd be divorcing? Zayn paid no attention to this but continued enthusiastically with the story. And right in the middle, I found the bride, a sweet little chit of a girl, all beautiful smelling from the smoke bath and finely dressed. Zayn became silent at this point and turned his small eyes on the faces of those present, his mouth agape, his two teeth jutting out. Mahjub, unable to contain himself, egged him on to complete the story. And what did you do then? Then I jumped on the bride. Having said which, he leapt up like a frog. Everyone broke into an uproar, and Zayn, exploding into laughter, and threw himself down on his stomach, kicking up his legs in the air. Then he turned over onto his back and said, still choking with laughter, I took hold of the little girl and bit her on the mouth. Mahjub was so shocked that he muttered, There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and asked his forgiveness for having ever heard, for having even heard something so terrible. I tell you, the women raised hell. The whole house was in an uproar, and the young bride began screaming. All of a sudden, I found that somebody struck me in the ankle with a knife. I tell you, I started running and didn't stop till I arrived back home. Suddenly, Zayn sat upright, the expression on his face wholly serious, and directing his words at Mahjub said, Listen, are you going to marry your daughter? Are you going to marry your daughter Alawiya to me, or aren't you? I promised the girl to you, right now before all these people here, Mahjub answered him in all seriousness, as though meaning what he said. After you have reaped your wheat and gathered up your dates and sold them and brought the money, we'll make the wedding celebration. This promise satisfied Zayn. For a while he remained silent with pursed lips, as though he had started to think about his future life with Alawiya and the responsibility of taking on the cares of a wife and children. That's it then, he said. Bear witness, brothers. This man has given his word, and he can't come along denying it tomorrow or the day after. All those present, Ahmed Ismail, Tahar Rawasi, Abdul Hafiz, Hamad Wad Rayaz, and Saeed the shopkeeper, stated that they were witnesses to the promise made by Mahjub and that the marriage would, God permitting, take place. The story of Zayn's love for Alawiya, the daughter of Mahjub, is the latest of his romances. After a month or two, he will tire of it and begin some new romance. For the present, though, he is completely taken up with her, and she is ever present in his mind. In the middle of the day, you find him in the field, bent over his hoe, his face pouring with sweat, when he suddenly stops digging and cries out at the top of his voice, I am slain by the love in the courtyard of Mahjub. In neighboring fields, tens of people momentarily stop digging as they listen to Zayn's cry. While the young men laugh, some of the older men, who are occasionally irritated by Zayn's tomfoolery, mumble with annoyance, What's that crazy boy gabbling about now? When at sunset work in the field comes to an end and the people take themselves off to their houses, Zayn walks home from the field amidst a large crowd of young men, boys and girls, all laughing merrily around him as he struts about among them, striking a young man on the shoulder, pinching a girl's cheek, and making leaps into the air. Whenever he sees an acacia bush along the way, he jumps over it and from time to time lets out shrieks at the top of his voice that resound through the village on which the sun has set. Hear ye, people, hear ye, you people of the village, O kingsfolk, I am slain by love in the courtyard of Mahjub. Zayn was first slain by love when he had still not attained manhood. He was 13 or 14 at the time and was as thin and emaciated as a dried up stalk. Whatever people might say about Zayn, they acknowledge his impeccable taste, for he fell in love with none but the most beautiful girls, the best mannered and most pleasant of speech. Azza, daughter of the Omda, was 15 years old, and her beauty had suddenly unfolded in the same way as a young palm tree flourishes when, after thirsting, it is given water. Her skin was as gold as a field of wheat just before harvesting. Her eyes were wide and black in a face of limpid beauty, her features delicate. Her eyelashes were long, and when she slowly raised them, one would experience a quickening of the heart. Zayn was the first to draw the attention of the young men of the village to Azza's beauty. One day he suddenly raised his voice whilst amid a great gathering of men brought together by the Umda for the cultivation of his field, raised his hoarse, piercing voice as does the cock at the break of dawn. Hear ye, O people of the village, O kingsfolk, Azza, the Umda's daughter, has slain herself a man. Zayn is slain in the courtyard of the Umda. The people were taken aback by such daring, and the Umda turned around sharply towards Zayn, instinctive anger rising within him. Suddenly, as though everyone had at one and the same instant become conscious of the laughable disparity between Zayn's appearance, standing there as though he were a dried up goat's skin, and between Azza, the Umda's daughter, they all burst out laughing at one accord. The anger died in the breast of the Umda, who was seated on a chair in the shade of a palm tree, red of eye and dusty of mustache as he spurred the people on to work. He was a serious, awe-inspiring man who seldom laughed. However, on this occasion, he gave a harsh, explosive laugh at Zayn's words. Zayn, he shouted out at him, if you go on working hard till evening, we'll give you Azza in marriage. And once again the people laughed, in deference to the Umda. Zayn, however, remained silent, his face serious and preoccupied, unconscious of the increasing strength and frequency of the strokes of his hoe in the ground. After that, after that month, After that, a month elapsed with Zayn talking of nothing but his love for Azza and her father's promise that he would marry her. The Omda knew how to exploit Zayn's emotions and gave him any number of arduous tasks which would have defeated the jinn themselves. So Zayn the lover would be seen bearing a yoke with tins of water on his back at high noon when the very stones groaned with the heat, hurrying to and fro as he watered the Umda's garden, or he would be found wielding an axe larger than himself and cutting down a tree or chopping up wood, or you'd come upon him earnestly engaged in gathering fodder for the Umda's donkeys, horses, and cows. And when once a week Azza smiled at him, the whole world could hardly contain him for joy. Not a month passed, though, before it became known in the village that Azza had become engaged to her cousin, who worked as a medical assistant at Abu Ashar. Without fuss, without saying a word, Zayn started on a new romance. One day the village awoke to his cries of, I am slain among the people of the coast. His Layla, This time was a young girl from among the Bedouin who lived along the Nile in the north of the Sudan and came down from the lands of the Kababish and the Dar Hamar, and from the encampments of the Hawawir and the Marsaib and Kordofan. At certain seasons, water became scarce in their lands, and they would journey down the Nile with their camels and sheep in search of watering for them. Sometimes years of drought, when the sky withheld rain, would bring them down, and they would arrive in droves at the watering places in the lands of Sharia and, and the Bideria who lived along the Nile. Most of them remained only until things got better, when they would return whence they had come, though some of them, taking a liking to the settled life in the Nile Valley, stayed on. The Bedouin of the coast were one such people. They continued to pitch their tents on the edge of the cultivated land where they pastured their sheep and sold the milk, collected wood for fuel, and hired themselves out at low prices in the date harvesting season. They did not intermarry with the local inhabitants, considering themselves to be pure Arabs. The village people, however, regarded them as uncouth Bedouin. Zayn, though, broke down this barrier. Always on the move, spending all day long wandering through the area from end to end, his feet one day led him for no particular reason to the people of the coast. He was roaming around the tents as though looking for something he'd lost, when a girl appeared, and Zayn, struck by her beauty, was rooted to the spot. The girl had heard of him, for his fame had reached even as far as the Bedouin of the coast, so she laughed and said jokingly, "Zayn, will you marry me?" He was speechless for a while. In the thrall of the girl's beauty, he was now made spellbound by the magic of her words. Then and there he called out at the top of his voice, "O people, she has slain me." Many heads craned out from the doors of the houses and from between the flaps of tents. The girl's mother called out, "Halima, what are you up to with that dervish?" And the girl's brothers rushed at Zayn, who took to flight. But Halima, the belle of the coast, thereafter became the object of infatuation that did not leave him till she was married. People got to hear about her, and many of the wealthy men of the village, the eligible youths and notables, came to ask for her hand in marriage from her father. In the end, she was married to the son of the Adi. The marriage of the Umda's daughter and that of Halima were a turning point in Zayn's life, for the mothers of young girls woke up to his importance as a trumpet by which attention was drawn to their daughters. In a conservative society where girls are hidden away from young men, Zayn became an emissary for love, transporting its sweet fragrance from place to place. Love, first of all, would strike at his heart, then would be quickly transferred to the heart of another, just as though Zayn were a broker, a salesman, or a postman. With his small mouse like eyes lurking in their sunken sockets, Zayn would look at a beautiful girl and would be overcome by something that was perhaps love. His innocent heart having succumbed to this love, his thin legs would carry him to the far corners of the village, running hither and thither like a bitch that has lost her pups, his tongue continually singing the girl's praises and calling out her name, so that ears were soon cocked and eyes on the lookout. Soon, too, some handsome young man's hand would stretch out to take that of the young girl. And when the wedding took place, if you looked around for Zayn, you'd find him either working away at filling pitchers and large ewers with water, or standing bare-chested, axe in hand, in the middle of a courtyard cutting up firewood, or exchanging good-natured banter with the women in the kitchen, while from time to time they fed him with titbits, and he'd burst out into that laugh of his, so like a donkey's brain. And then would begin another romance, and from each romance Zayn would emerge unscathed, and to all appearances unchanged, his laugh unaltered, his tomfoolery in no wise lessened, and his legs never weary of bearing his body to the outlying parts of the village. Years of abundance replete with love were experienced by Zayn. The young girl's mothers went out of their way to gain his affection, tempting him into their houses where they'd give him food to eat and tea and coffee to drink. On entering, a seat of honor would be spread out for him and breakfast or lunch served up in the best crockery, after which mint tea would be brought if it happened to be morning, or strong tea with milk if afternoon. After the tea, he'd be served coffee with cinnamon, cardamom, and ginger, be it morning or afternoon. No sooner did the women hear that Zayn was in a nearby house than they'd flock to him, for they were amused by his raillery. Mothers would urge their daughters to go along and greet him, and lucky the one that gained a place in his heart and whose name was upon his lips when he went out. For such a girl was guaranteed a husband within a month or two. Perhaps Zayn instinctively became aware of the importance of his new status and so began to play hard to get with the girls' mothers and would show hesitation before accepting an invitation to breakfast or lunch. Yet with all this, there was one girl in the district about whom Zayn did not speak and with whom he never played the fool. She was a girl who would observe him from afar with beautiful, sullen eyes, and whenever he saw her approaching, he would fall silent and leave off his raillery and buffoonery. If he spotted her far off, he would flee from her presence, leaving the road to her.